Hey, okay, today I'd like to get a little bit more in depth into the biology of stress. And we're actually going to discuss how stress can make us more prone to cardiovascular heart disease, high blood pressure, and stroke. We're looking at not only cardiovascular disease, but one of its subcategories is the atherosclerotic heart disease. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit more. We're going to get a little bit more in depth today. When we look at the idea of how our body is designed to respond to the fight or flight response, right? Fight or flight response happens, we see a stressor. Immediately, we get a signal that goes from the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands, and that signal is to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are adrenaline and noradrenaline, they've been also called. They are the ones that respond in seconds. That jacks up your heart rate, gets you ready for the fight. At the same time, your hypothalamus sends a signal, which is something called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Fancy word, I use fancy words. And it goes to the pituitary gland and gets it to release something called ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropin hormone. That sends a signal to the adrenals, and that releases something called the glucocorticoids, which are various hormones that, much like norepinephrine and epinephrine, act both as neurotransmitters and as hormones in the body. You can basically think about it that the epi and norepi are something that happens within seconds, and they have a very short effect, while the glucocorticoids have more of a long-term effect, minutes to hours. Okay, so now we've got those being released, but as well, what's get released is glucagon. And glucagon comes out of the pancreas. It's designed to rip through the system, releasing all our glucose storages, and that glucose goes into our bloodstream, and it helps us to have energy for this threat coming. Now, at the same time, your pituitary gland releases something called prolactin. And prolactin is designed to do many things, but one of the things it does is it's designed to suppress our reproductive response and reproductive drive. How's this important? Obviously, during times of high stress, it's probably not the best time to get it on and have a kid. Now, this becomes particularly interesting, a little bit off topic, in women who are often from a history of abuse or even just under high stress currently have difficulty getting pregnant or maintaining a pregnancy because they're not designed to. And then unfortunately, you take that underlying stress, you add to it the stress of trying to get pregnant, and it's this nasty cycle that just keeps going and interfering with the process of getting pregnant. Can be incredibly stressful. Okay, what also happens is we also start to release something called endorphins, endogenous morphine, our painkillers, and something called enkephalins. These are basically various forms of endogenous painkillers. And the problem is long-term exposure to these can end up leading to a resistance to them. So our ability to suppress our own pain in the long term becomes compromised. So another thing that's released is something called vasopressin. And vasopressin is designed to do, again, many things. But in this case, we're looking at it because it retards the production of urine or release of urine in the kidneys. Now, yes, during fear, we often empty our bladders. Animals do it all the time. But that's out of circulation. It's in the bladder. We release it to release basically unneeded weight so you can run faster or fight better. However, in the kidneys, they'll stop releasing urine because essentially we want a little bit more blood volume and fluid volume in our body, and we don't want to just keep on releasing it through urine. So the kidneys shut down. Now, again, another one of my side notes is an interesting point to that. One of the things that the kidneys also stop releasing with the urine is something called uric acid. Uric acid you may have heard of in reference to the disease gout, which is often a high level of uric acid in the bloodstream that eventually leads to uric acid crystal production, and that leads to the gouty arthritis. Now, what's interesting is that while uric acid crystals have such a powerful inflammatory response to the body and create all that pain, Uric acid itself has a specific purpose, again, among many others, and that's that it's an anti-inflammatory. So during high stress, our body will keep more uric acid in the system. And for those who suffer from gout, this is really important, because what they've realized is even though the medications often used for gout are designed to suppress the creation of uric acid by interfering with something called xanthine oxidase, lots of big words. Most people aren't overproducers of uric acid. They're under excretors of uric acid, right? That's the problem. So this can have many effects on the ideas of gout. And just as a side note to that, to my side note, the dietary intervention for gout that they've touted for years, the purines and the low protein, bullshit. Doesn't work. Actually makes it worse in some ways. But we can talk about that in another one. Okay, so we also inhibit other hormones during this stressful period. So growth hormones, insulin, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, a lot of the ones we kind of want moving around in our body, these are the ones we inhibit. Okay, as a quick side note, no, not as a side note, this is an important one to take in. And this is before we get to the specifics on the atherosclerotic heart disease. One of the interesting things they have found is that if you look at, take the norepinephrine and epinephrine versus the glucocorticoids as two distinctly different parts of the, the fight or flight response. What's interesting is some people stay a little bit more in the, let's say, the epi and norepi stage versus the glucocorticoid stage. Those in epi and norepi tend to stay more with anxiety. Those in the glucocorticoid stage for longer periods of time tend to have depression. And what's interesting is that they can be mutually exclusive. So if the stimulation increases enough to create the more epi and norepi response, or more of an anxiety response, you can actually get yourself out of depression with anxiety. This is important in the idea of coping mechanisms, because you often see people with these patterns that we talked about, the DTD, the CPTSD, shit like that, is that there's this underlying long-term depression that they're dealing with. And you'll find that those people, weirdly enough, do very well in emergency situations. In fact, they feel better in emergency situations. In fact, that's why they usually do very well in things like uniformed services and emergency medicine. I did great as an EMT. It was easy because essentially that constant state of emergency keeps you out of depression and just into anxiety. And anxiety is a lot more manageable, right? You can just keep running from thing to thing. But what also can happen is that when the emergency is over, in order to avoid the depression, another emergency needs to be created. So these are people who sometimes have a real problem with relaxation. They can't take it easy. The minute one stressor disappears, another has to appear. If it isn't coming from outside, they end up unwittingly, remember the concepts of allostasis we talked about, they end up unwittingly creating a stressor. That stressor can be anything from emergency back pain to picking a fight with your spouse out of nothing. Right? You don't realize it's nothing. You're creating the situation unbeknownst to you. However, it helps to balance that depression versus anxiety. And usually the depression is much more dangerous and much more psychologically painful. Okay. Now let's talk about more specific to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so the stressor appears. Our heart rate goes up because the epi and the norepi get pumped through. At the same time, our parasympathetic tone, they call it, which is the vagus nerve tone, goes down, so it gets reduced. The glucocorticoids that activate the neurons in the brain are released. They enhance the epi and the norepi. This causes the venous tone to start to contract. Why? Because we want that blood to flow faster and harder through the system. and the heart walls start to distend a little bit and then bounce back harder and harder and harder in order to shove the blood faster through. So the rate goes up, the force goes up, and then the blood pressure goes up. Now, there's another reason, and this becomes very important. So remember we talked about how the glucose is released into the system? Well, what also happens now is that there's signals to release more platelets into the system, right? We might end up bleeding. We talked about cortisol, and you have to increase your cholesterol to get your cortisol up. So now there's more cholesterol in the system. A few other things get released into the system as well. What this does is also causes the blood to be a little more viscous, a little bit more sticky, right? So you need even more force to get that through, to get all those substances which we're going to use throughout the body out to them. So the venous system constricts more. The arterioles, or where the arteries branch out into the muscles, actually dilate more to get more blood into the arterioles, and our blood flow to, we talked about before, the thinking parts of the brain, digestive system, starts to go down. Now, what also starts to happen is, this is how it's designed to work when it's under acute stress. However, if this goes on long term, this is what starts to happen. First, that heart wall is working harder and harder and harder and harder, right? What happens to a muscle that you work really hard? It gets bigger. That may sound great when you talk about your bicep, but not so great when you're talking about your heart. Ever heard of left ventricular hypertrophy or an enlarged heart? What happens is that specifically the left ventricle, so it's part of the heart that's pushing out to the system, ends up getting enlarged. The problem with an enlarged heart is because it's a chamber, not exactly a chamber, but for this purpose, it's a chamber. When it's this big, it can squeeze properly and get stuff out. As it gets bigger and bigger and thicker, it's like that bodybuilder who can't like bend their arm all the way anymore, right? It can't fully contract. So it gets filled with blood, and not enough blood gets into the system. Now, this heart also is placing a higher demand on the coronary arteries. Your heart, even though it pumps all this blood through, it doesn't use that blood. It needs its own blood supply, and that's the coronary arteries. So as coronary arteries become overworked, in addition to being overworked, in order to force that blood through quicker, they actually constrict, unlike the rest of the muscles. So they get a little constricted and they get a little narrower. This is going to become important a little bit later. This makes the heart much more prone, besides to the enlargement, it also makes it much more prone to things like arrhythmias, which is irregular heartbeats. People often experience it as palpitations in the beginning. Okay, so now you've got a heart that's overworking. Remember how those veins we talked about, they contract? Well, long-term contraction, they're still muscular. They're not as muscular as the arteries, but they are still muscular. They're designed to be much more flexible, a little easier going. So if they stay contracted longer, they start to get more muscular than they should be. For them, the musculature ends up being less flexible. So now you have a constant state of high blood pressure because those veins just don't move as well, right? They're not nice and smooth and easy. They're like stiff and rigid, and it's getting harder for the blood to get through. So now you have this increase in blood pressure, and you have more potential for backup down the system. That backup can lead to right-sided heart failure as well. So you have a left-sided heart failure going, now you have right-sided heart failure. Then we look at how our blood circulatory system works, and basically, in order to constantly get out to the system, your blood vessels bifurcate. They split over and over again. You have these little splits. That split point is a major point for where the blood hits. So if you picture like a fork in the road here, the blood hits here, boom, and then splits across it. But what happens is this much more viscous blood that's being driven at a much harder rate and a harder level is going to eventually create damage, most likely at those bifurcation points where everything's just a little thinner, a little weaker. It's a split. What happens is little craters or pockets develop there. Because of that, an inflammatory response happens. Fatty foam cells start to aggregate to that area to help to repair the damage. But the inflamed area is now a little swollen. Now it has those fatty cells. The problem is, remember we talked about that viscous blood? Well, then platelets and fats and the cholesterol and the glucose and all that other stuff that's running through your blood will aggregate to that area, making you very prone to atherosclerotic heart disease. If that breaks loose, it's going to run through the system until it gets to a narrower area and it gets stuck in there. Now, that could lead to something just distal down into the muscles, causing extreme pain. If it's in one of those coronary arteries that we already talked about that's a little narrowed, that's your heart attack. If it's in the brain, that's your stroke. Okay, so now we have this aggregation in the area. What's really interesting is that when they've looked at rats, monkeys, other animals that actually have a similar response that we do to stress, what they found is that stress will impact those types of health independent of diet. So you can take an animal, put it under high stress, and high stress that doesn't stop, that it just feels helpless against, and it will create the same cardiovascular issues as what we thought was for somebody who had a terrible diet. You can feed them a healthy diet and it'll still happen. You can then take another animal and feed them what's considered a more unhealthy diet, high fats, high sugar, and high carbohydrates, which is sugar actually. But put them in a situation where they have very manageable or easy stress, and actually their cardiovascular system is going to look much healthier than that other animal. So even though we know that diet, and I'm not saying have a shit diet, don't have a shit diet, have a good diet, it's better. But what we're starting to understand is potentially our diet takes a second place to our psychological makeup. Now, what's interesting about that is when we look at ideas in Chinese medicine, we see a correlation. In Chinese medicine, we talk about a specific organ or channel called the liver channel. Don't think of it as necessarily just the liver organ, but it actually does have some connection to it. In Chinese medicine, they often talk about this idea of the liver overacting on the other channel called the spleen channel. And the spleen is the one that has a lot more to do with our ability to digest and transform foods and fluids into what we need. And the spleen gets impacted heavily by overthinking or anxiety. So the ability to digest gets impacted. The liver is more in the realm of anger, but also depression. When that overacts on the spleen, our digestive system gets interrupted. So we're starting to see correlations in this idea of how Chinese medicine looks at stressors which affect the liver channel, and its over response to the digestive system, which is the spleen channel. And then the spleen's inability to digest in Chinese medicine, we say interferes with the ability to transform and transport, often the idea of fluids, and fluids that build up in Chinese medicine create dampness. Dampness ends up drying up a little bit, creating phlegm. We actually think about that when we look at things like high cholesterol, atherosclerotic heart disease, strokes, well, what forms the stroke. So we're seeing a lot of good correlations between the Chinese medicine and the Western medicine. So managing our stress, or stress response, not the external stressors, remember, we're always talking about the internal response, is in some ways much more important for us. Okay, that's it for today. I hope this was helpful. See you next time.